Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lucy Roche, and I'm from Taylor and Townsend. We are joined today by Natalie Gardner, who is also from Taylor and Townsend. So, the purpose of this event is a retrofit information support and expertise RISE event, which is fully funded by the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, delivered by Taylor and Townsend. So, thanks to everyone who has joined. I will now hand over to Natalie to start today.
Okay. Thank you. We're going to cover a bit about the science of climate change, policy around that, greenhouse gas accounting, and how to implement that into your retrofit planning and take that into account in generally upgrading your stock. So yeah, as Lucy said, I'm Natalie Gardner. I'm one of the principal consultants here at Turner and Townsend. I have been working here for about 2 years, specifically on the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund and the delivery partner aspect of that too. So yes, I'm one of the consultants here. My background's in regeneration, but I also have a BSc previously in geography, physical and human, which is why I am in this field specifically. And a lot of the questions we find when we're doing any sort of business case around sustainability consulting is always having to go back to the data, going back to the climate science part to build that story. And it's around giving those drivers that are both international. So of course we know that there is a climate emergency at a large scale, but being able to communicate that down to the national and even the local implications of climate change. So that's a bit why we're talking about this today, and hopefully giving you some practical tools to start thinking about how to implement it into your own business cases. Okay. So I'll just click through into the agenda. As I said, climate change, we'll start with that, a bit of the science and policy. Greenhouse gas accounting, if you're familiar with the greenhouse gas protocol, that's a good standard that you can always have. It's a methodology for dividing, classifying, and counting your carbon or your greenhouse gas emissions. And then finally on to action planning. So in a regular run-of-the-mill day, we are getting energy from the sun, and it's essential for enabling life on Earth. And greenhouse gases, which include carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, etc., exist within the atmosphere, and they trap that energy within the atmosphere and maintain and determine the temperature of Earth. There's a lot of complex cycles happening here between the atmosphere and the sea that help regulate. And really, when we're talking about climate change, we're talking about the imbalance that's happening between those systems, those cycles, that's generally prompted through human activity that causes us to release more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And therefore it creates that thicker blanket, you might have heard it described, of atmosphere that stops us from being able to regulate the temperature of the Earth at that level that we've become accustomed to. It means that more heat is trapped, and that leads to further temperature rises, which we'll look at in a bit more detail. Here you can see in the graph 5 independent climate research data hubs and the temperatures that have been recorded since 1880. You see that general trend all the way up. Well, I say general trend, a very significant trend above zero. And you can see that for the most part, they've all recorded similar temperatures. So that's a key thing, getting independent sources and bring them together to see a similar trend. And having the data can be vital in getting buy-in for any climate change decarbonisation plan with key stakeholders. Of course, some of you have probably seen this before, when we're talking about carbon, we'll discuss it in terms of its density within the unit we discuss it in terms of its density in the atmosphere is parts per million of atmospheric parts. And therefore, in this case, you can see here that as of 2022, we're close to 420 parts per million, whereas our pre-industrial levels that are often quoted are around 300 parts per million. The Earth's climate has changed throughout history, as I'm sure you're all aware, and just in the last 650,000 years, there have been 7 cycles of glacial advance and retreat. And with this, the last ice age being around 11,700 years ago, that is, of course, when society and civilization could really thrive. We could become agrarian, and we had that temperature that really suited us for being able to expand and grow our cities and develop our homes eventually. Most of the climate change wibbles and wobbles you can see on that graph are attributed to very small variations in the Earth's orbit that change the amount of solar gain that we get. And across that time, we've also got our glaciation periods, glacial retreat and advancement. What we are more familiar with today, because of course that's looking at the very big historic view on climate change, is the policy that is now shaping and informing the things that we do across our sectors to mitigate further warming. So two of these papers or parties you'll be most aware of are the United Framework Convention on Climate Change, so the UNFCCC, and they're the ones who their convention led to the Paris Agreement, which a lot of us are aware of that 2 degrees increase, which we're now looking at 1.5 instead. And then you have the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and that's a scientific body that reports on the projections, forecasts, impacts, and future risks. And they're the ones we're often looking at that will cascade that kind of directive down to the rest of the countries that are setting their policy on climate change. The IPCC is nearly universal agreement, whereas the Paris Agreement is legally binding. It's important that we have these agreed at an international level because obviously the cycles between our different systems, the sea, the atmosphere, where we produce increased greenhouse gases on one side of the earth through to where we consume on another side, we are all connected. And it's never truer than with climate change. We've shifted from the 2 degrees target of not increasing temperatures above 2 degrees since pre-industrial temperatures down to 1.5. The IPCC published this recently, and so that's because they've identified that global warming to just 2 degrees above could actually mean that 1.7 billion more people experience severe heat waves at least once every 5 years. There are other changes there. You see sea rise on average another 10 centimeters and up to several hundred million more people becoming exposed to climate-related risks and poverty. There's obviously the biodiversity risk as well when we start affecting our ecology, such as coral reefs, who are important regulators and support mechanisms for other life systems. We are basically saying with any target that we'd originally looked at 2 degrees, it still has huge, significant impacts on our migration that is climate related, on our sea levels that of course creates issues and stress on the land available for farming and for development, and our ecological support systems that we have there are also challenged by this 2 degree increase. Therefore, it's seen to bring that down to 1.5 and advised that now all targets and policies should be gearing towards that because we've appreciated how significant the problems can be with the 2 degrees. Let me just load up the animations on here. Key temperatures to keep in mind. As I said, there was a realization in the Paris Agreement pledges that limiting warming to just below 2 degrees was not enough. And the commitments from countries that are made to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions as part of their climate change mitigation. And these commitments include necessary policies and measures for achieving the global targets set out in the Paris Agreement. So those nationally described commitments currently, if we sit with everything as we have as policies, only going to get us to 2.4 degrees below pre-industrial period. So that's why the Paris Agreement that was aimed at 2% at 2 degrees was seen as not significant enough because obviously our policies are still not really quite getting us there. By aiming for 1.5, we're hoping to push efforts to limit the temperature increase to even less and therefore mitigating against the risk that I just explained in the previous slide. And our global temperature right now, to understand where we're at, is 1.2 degrees. I'm just going to skip over this slide and I'll come back to it at the end if we do have time, but this is basically showing us the shift in the highest daily maximum temperature over the last year. It was I think it was 1993, it was rare that we were exceeding 30 degrees as the highest daily temperature. Now we're seeing that more and more globally. The IPCC working group, this was a report published in 2022. They projected that greenhouse gas emissions from the nationally determined contributions announced prior to the COP26 would make it likely that warming would exceed 1.5. Like I said, we're currently at 1.2. And it would also make it harder after 2030 to limit warming to below 2 degrees. So what they're looking at now, or what you can see on the screen right now, is a trend for implemented policies, if we were to continue as we are, would be this red line, keeping us at our GHG equivalent being up towards the 60. And then if you're looking at limiting warming to 1.5, we are on this downward projection towards 2050 of how we can reduce the parts per million of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. The good news, and I think it is important that we do highlight this, is that there is significant progress towards achieving this limitation on temperature increase. And every sector has the potential to halve their emissions by 2030. The solutions to achieve this are known, and we'll cover those in the next slides. But in housing specifically, we're choosing to focus on retrofit as a way to decarbonise the existing housing stock that we have. As we know, it's a huge factor in potentially reducing our carbon footprint as a sector. To be clear, when we're talking about greenhouse gases, we're talking about, let's say, largely carbon dioxide, which is approximately 76% of total global emissions, but also methane, nitrous oxide, and I always get this wrong, my halogens. My lecturer would tell me off for that, forgetting what they're called. The shorthand as we describe it is usually COE equivalent. So when you hear about greenhouse gases, we're talking about methane, nitrous oxide, and your halogens and your carbon dioxide all in one, and those that aren't carbon dioxide are converted into a carbon dioxide equivalent. All gases are converted and they're based on their global warming potential. You'll often see this in reports described as GWP. And if you're looking at greenhouse gas accounting, there are also conversion rates that you would need to apply for different activities your organization practices. This is an interesting graphic of what a ton of carbon looks like, carbon dioxide looks like. The idea that your molecule of carbon dioxide, a ton of it, is equivalent of operating a red bus, a double-decker red bus. And if you want to compare emissions over time per person per product, there is a interesting data source from the Global Carbon Budget, which gives you an idea of the proportionate output, the carbon footprint of individuals per country. The average carbon footprint of person will vary greatly. And so you've got a line there at the top for the United States, and you'll see Kenya at the bottom. So in this case, emission rates per person per country do vary based on the infrastructure they have and the available choices they have and the intensity of their country to produce resources and services. In terms of carbon footprint, there are multiple calculators as well, which I think we reference at the end. Always curious to understand what your own impact is, so you can understand where to make changes, but also really important for us not to just push the responsibility on the individual. We also need to understand our sectors and where they have responsibility to reduce embodied carbon, but also operational carbon. And we'll get onto those definitions in a minute. So I'll give you an example of carbon footprint, which is always interesting, which is around the banana. So how bad are bananas? Or how bad is coffee with milk or without milk? I think actually let's look at that one. So a large cappuccino is 230 grams of CO2 equivalent to produce that versus 21 grams if you're having just a black coffee, showing you again that, we have these individual choices of adding the milk, but the milk is part of a wider system that creates carbon, and therefore that's where those two factors, those levers of change need to occur. I think it's similar when we look at housing in terms of reducing demand within the household through behaviors of the resident, but also through the way that we build the systems and the house in itself. Just to drill home that business case, so to speak, around the importance of reducing or limiting our increase in temperature, the UK Met Office highlights the following risks in the event of warming beyond 2 degrees. And I think we feel it most being an island that has low-lying areas around its river mouths, as well as having high-density developments at those river mouths, because economically that would have been a very successful spot to locate a city. So we have low-lying and coastal regions that are greatly in danger of flooding. I'm sure in your own local areas as well, you'll have development plans for those to mitigate it. Down in the south in London, we have the Thames Barrier Plan for mitigating global flood risk and rises. There are threats to farming and domestic food security due to soil abrasion, flooding risk, but also increased temperatures that might not allow certain crops to grow. We also have increased drought and water insecurity that comes from that and is connected to the domestic food security risk, and more frequent floods, storms, and extreme heat causing damage to buildings, transport, and human health. Human health one doesn't get touched on as much, but especially in housing, I think we notice it in terms of overheating. And what we have here is during summer, there's an increased risk of summer heat stroke. During summer heat waves of 2003, I think it was, and 2006 and 2009, there are estimated 2,980 excessive deaths from that increased heat, meaning that, based on statistics standard for usual deaths in the country, the increase and excess of deaths that were directly due to overheating were monitored to be 2,980. I think that's significant when we think that we can control the air quality in our homes that we can design to prevent overheating and that we can design for insulation. It shows us how important that is for the housing sector to recognise that we will be having to mitigate in our designs for increased temperatures. To stay within the 1.5 degree limit, we need to achieve net zero emissions by mid-century. So you will have heard 2050 as a target for a lot of sectors, if not a lot of local boroughs or cities and councils. This involves rapid decarbonisation across all sectors, and it's largely targeting those areas of energy, so transitioning from renewable energy, transitioning away from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources. In industry, we're implementing cleaner technologies. In transport, we're promoting electric vehicles, sustainable transport, and also looking at obviously more actively connecting developments so that can make sensible choices as an individual around your mobility. We're looking at buildings to improve their energy efficiency, which is why we're talking today. And in terms of land use, we're trying to enhance carbon sinks through reforestation and sustainable land management. A few extra points there just to show you how steep the expected reduction is between 2030 and 2050. And I think what we also need to answer is always what happens after 2050. There will be residual carbon emissions. It will be unlikely that in all cases every sector will be able to decarbonize themselves. And so we also need to think of the long term in terms of how do we further reduce our footprint after 2050. If you are considering offsets, this is something that you might have been reading around. There's often a debate between how you should offset, be that through long-term storage of carbon or through a localized approach to implementing renewables. It's not something for today's conversation, but I highly recommend reading the Oxford Golden Principles on Offsetting. They'll give you an idea of what the debate is, because I think offsetting is another term that we tend to throw around, and it needs unpacking of what is kind of good offsetting and what is tokenistic. So we've gone through a bit of the science, a bit of the policy that's being shaped and that is now going to shape us as a sector. Let's have a look at the methodology for accounting your carbon. The road to net zero is outlined by the Climate Change Committee, and in 2019 the direct burning of fossil fuels to heat space and water in homes accounted for 13% of the UK's total carbon emissions. So that's UK's total carbon emissions. Just remember that there are other sectors contributing to it as well. It's a very significant amount, and housing providers have a significant role to play in helping reach the UK target. Some of you might be familiar with the breakdown in emissions scopes. So when we're talking about greenhouse gas accounting, you are breaking that down into three main scopes: scope 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1 we'll go into in a second, and 2, they do have defined measures around how you can identify them and how you can bring them into your accounting. Why I say that in talking about definition is because companies are structured in different ways, and like any accounting practice, you need to set a methodology for how you're going to avoid double counting between your assets. So if you are interested in looking in more detail at this and how to do it, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is an international standard that's been established with standards and guidance documents available for free on their website that define how to define your own scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and how to do that for activities within each of those emissions. It's incredibly helpful, very straightforward, and if you're working in an organization that has multiple entities, it's a very useful way, or multiple entities or leased assets. So for example, you lease an office but you don't own it. It gives great guidance on how to equate for those kind of grey areas as well. So scope 1 emissions, these are your direct emissions that a company owns or controls. An example of this could be burning fuel in company-owned vehicles or in company-owned facilities such as your offices. Scope 1 covers emissions from sources directly linked to the organisation itself. Basically, where do you have the most influence? That's why it's in the centre there. Scope 2 emissions, these are your indirect emissions caused by a company, but they occur from sources that are not owned or controlled by it. So for example, that could be the energy that the company purchases and uses for electricity generation. It could also be emissions associated with the company's energy consumption at other facilities. In the case of housing specifically, it might not be around your business, it might not be around your transportation by ship and freight, but it could be considered to be your business travel. So how your employees use their cars. Scope 3, this encompasses emissions that are neither produced by the company itself nor directly linked to an asset. Scope 3 emissions occur up and downstream of the value supply chain. So what I mean by that is it could be from disposal product use, or other things that you might buy in, other services associated with your business. For housing associations with Scope 3, that could be the works that happen on site to construct new developments through demolition, or again through any of the end-of-life processes that happen with your waste products. Where you draw the line around that Scope 3, it's going to be very important to define with your supply chain, because they ultimately are going to be inheriting that as their Scope 1. So it's interesting when we work with organizations of where they're ready to draw the line on Scope 3. It can often feel like the more complicated emission and more daunting emission to calculate, largely because it feels so unknown. And that is because your direct emissions, you often have consumption and energy data from the bills that you pay. Scope 2, you often have a better idea because it will be reported into you through something else that you pay for. And Scope 3, a lot of that is outsourced. Naturally, because so many of our activities as the housing sector are also outsourced to the construction sector, if you're joining today as a landlord, that Scope 3 often equates to like your largest proportion of your footprint, because all of these scopes go towards your total footprint. I started to allude to this actually, because when we work with clients, we start with setting the purpose of emissions reporting. Here, you're understanding why are we going out and doing this, and you're doing it because you're mitigating against risk. Understanding where the hot spot activities are, the most carbon intensive activities are, is a great way for you to be able to start reducing your footprint, and therefore also limit the amount of risk you might be exposing yourself to future regulations that might come in place for charging against carbon emissions. You're trying to identify cost-effective opportunities that allow you to reduce your footprint, but you're also at this stage setting targets and measuring and reporting against them. It's going to be important if you have any idea about your activities and the emissions that they're producing. We can say 2050 is the net zero goal, but what is actually a realistic goal for you will depend on how quickly you can invest in reducing the carbon emissions and how quickly you can roll that out with your teams. There are some very real barriers to being able to reduce carbon emissions. And so setting the purpose of reporting at the very start is going to be key for getting it clear in your mind that you need to address your target, not just based on an international or national target, but also an internal realistic target. As a second step, you're evaluating the extent of your organizational structure and defining the boundaries. So as I talked about, which assets are you a landlord of, which ones are owned, which ones are leased, which ones are tenanted. You're setting your operational boundaries. So that's where you start identifying all of your Scope 1 emissions. So that's the direct emissions from combustion on site. You're understanding your Scope 2, your purchased energy, and your Scope 3, that's everything else outside of that. So that's your boundaries. Step 4, you're choosing the baseline year. I'd advise you're going for the most recent complete set of data you have across your Scope 1, 2, and 3. Often what this looks like is an internal process of data mapping. So understanding, once we've defined our boundaries, so the activities that feed into 1, 2, and 3, what data do we have against each of those scopes of emission? Energy consumption bills, maybe purchase orders raised for refrigerant coolant, which would fall into Scope 3. Which would fall into Scope 1. And doing that data exercise to understand where all of this information can be found will allow you to put together a baseline of your carbon equivalent emissions. At stage 5, you're collecting that activity data that you've mapped out where it's sourced from, and you're choosing the emissions factors based on the GHG protocol and calculating using a transparent methodology. That methodology, as I said, is set out in the GHG protocol and does allow you to see which activities are covered by certain methodologies. An example where there can be a bit of a grey zone is where a company has business travel that's provided in business vehicles versus business travel that's then in a leased car. There's guidance provided in the GHG protocol about how you go about calculating both of those. 6 is managing that inventory quality. So once you've been able to map out where your data is, you've collated it, you've started to calculate your baseline, you need to understand, have we got the most quality data here and how are we going to improve it going forward? And so whenever we're talking about establishing accounting practices, you're also looking at the structure of your organization to enable it to monitor and improve the data it collects on the activities that feed into your carbon emissions. So you're establishing processes and procedures. You're ensuring that you have quality checks and quality control in process. And the process must be replicable year on year so that you're truly monitoring and moving towards your target. There are regulations in place and PAS standards that you can follow. PAS 2080 is carbon leadership, and that is a great methodology for having a look at how you can make that organizational change necessary to monitor, track, and improve your data and leadership around your greenhouse gas emissions. I think setting boundaries is a key one. All our organizations are set up slightly differently, and different organizations will be at different maturity levels in terms of the amount of data they have access to. So it's going to be really key when you're defining your boundaries is where are your biggest impacts. So do you feel potentially more than 40% of your total emissions are coming from an activity, house building, maintenance and repairs, communal heating systems that are gas currently? You want to have a look when you're defining that as well. You can filter it by, is there a clear opportunity for energy efficiency? So once you found your big hitters, your big hitting activities that create the most greenhouse gases, is there a clear opportunity for energy efficiency to be implemented? So with example of communal heating system, is that currently on gas? That's going to be one of your bigger hitting activities. Is there a chance for you to then focus in on that one and understand how you can move towards more energy efficiency and low carbon measures? Also, when you're looking at your activities that you're doing, you want to understand, is there a potential future resource or energy risk associated with that activity that might increase the amount we consume, or it might have an increase in costs implications for you to maintain that system as it is. In housing specifically, it's also really important to look at the life cycle of UK homes and buildings. We have operational emissions, which are directly related to the day-to-day running of a property, but we also have the embedded emissions. So that's top and tail of this slide. Embodied emissions are those emissions that are related to the extractive raw materials that go into the production of the product, being the building itself, the maintenance, repair, and demolition. Demolition does release emissions, as well as the process of bringing demolition vehicles on to site to do the works and take down the building also comes with its own emissions. Therefore, the total life cycle and carbon footprint of a building is the operational emissions added to the embodied emissions. In housing, we have key methods to reduce operational emissions. So here we have the reduction of targets in building regulations, so that Part L that's coming in that guides us towards that. Also have planning requirements by some local authorities as well. There's sustainability assessment rating schemes, which are obviously voluntary, such as BREEAM, LEED, and NEIGHBOR. I believe that's Australian, but coming to the UK. And you can see there's been a policy support and funding available for retrofitting buildings. So this is how we reduce our operational, but we need to be mindful whenever we're doing accounting or we're considering how we reduce the impact of emissions through housing specifically, that we're thinking about whole life cycle costs and the whole product from production through to decommission and rebuild. There's some interesting work around that we've done with the GLA previously, I believe, where we're looking at, what is the value of retrofit versus new build and demolition versus just knock it down and leave it, so to speak. And forgive me, it wasn't the GLA, it was another local authority who I can't remember right now. But the idea being that whenever you're in housing, you're having to build that case against, the do nothing, the what if we start over again, and the what if we maintain. And increasingly we're seeing embodied carbon come into that calculation. Originally, it might have been the carbon emissions through the operational carbon of that building, reducing the energy demand, shifting to low carbon energy sources. But now we're also thinking about the embodied carbon in that calculation to help us make better choices on longer programs where you have organizations that have multiple homes to either retrofit, renovate, or dispose of. This slide just shows you the difference between left and right on those two graphs. You've got building regulations as they currently are, compliant with new building, where basically two-thirds of the energy would be expected to come from two-thirds of the emissions would be expected to come from operational activities and just under a quarter from the production. Whereas if we're looking at ultra low energy buildings, we're actually expecting that 50% of the emissions come from the production, and in use over its longer life cycle, we're actually looking at a far more reduced amount of energy operational emissions. However, you will see that the share of maintenance and replacement is greater in the ultra low energy building. That's not necessarily a bad thing. To me, it sounds like we should, of course, be expecting that we reduce the overall long-term life cycle. If we're expecting our homes to last for 100 years, that operational carbon is really important to keep low, and that production value we need to keep tackling to make sure that we're keeping a low amount of emissions coming through the embodied route. I think you'll all be familiar with the net zero carbon definition, but let's just clarify it because we often hear net zero and neutrality together hand in hand. Achieving net zero carbon means that any carbon dioxide released in the atmosphere by an organization's activity is reduced as much as possible first, and then balanced by any equivalent amount of offsetting. This activity releases net zero carbon into the that is a wrong phrase. But basically what I'm saying is net zero carbon is reducing it as much as you can further to zero emissions. This is a definition from UK GBC, and Letty have also used it in their climate emergency design guide. Carbon neutrality is something different. It's probably more likely what organizations had previously meant in the last 10 years when they were talking about becoming net zero. They're probably talking about neutrality, and we're finding this out more as we start to unpick those targets and seeing where companies are on their route to actually achieving net zero. They're finding that perhaps carbon neutrality was more what they were looking at, because this means that CO2 emissions are effectively cancelled out by offsetting. There's no prerequisite to reduce as far as possible to achieve carbon neutrality. You can essentially become carbon neutral tomorrow if you offset all of your emissions. That, of course, has its limitations because, in a way, offsetting is still an area where we need to understand, will it have potential if you're offsetting on one side of the world versus your production on another? Do they keep up in pace? Is the quality there? Is it long term? There are a lot of questions about the effectiveness on reducing global temperatures. However, I will say I'm absolutely not an expert in this field, and I think we do all need to just be challenging each other on the assumptions of offsetting, its effectiveness, but also its limitations. So we'll just move on to where this fits into your retrofit. In terms of connecting the dots between climate change, greenhouse gas accounting and retrofit, really what we're seeing in the housing sector is we are establishing a carbon reduction hierarchy that goes from avoidance through to offset. The first step is to avoid activities or processes that generate carbon emissions wherever possible. And this involves making conscious choices to reduce energy consumption, waste, and emissions. So what you might see, for example, is you're avoiding unnecessary travel or opting for virtual meetings instead of physical ones. That's your top of the hierarchy. That's your first step. Then you're going down into minimization. So if avoidance is not feasible, then the next step is, can we minimize our carbon emissions by optimizing our processes or using energy efficient technologies and reducing waste? For instance, can we improve the building insulation or use energy efficient appliances in a property? Where that's not possible, is there a chance that we can substitute? So replacing high carbon processes or materials with lower carbon alternatives. For example, using renewable energy sources such as solar instead of using fossil fuels. And lastly, if none of that is possible, then when we're looking at offsetting, when all other options are exhausted, offsetting carbon emissions through investing in projects that remove emissions elsewhere. For example, you might be familiar with reforestation projects or carbon capture projects and renewable energy projects. You can look at community renewable energy projects, for example, as one source of this. Example of this. An example of action planning relates to the carbon reduction hierarchy. And so in the reduction stage, these are possible approaches that can be taken to reduce total carbon. Here you have an example of reduced employee travel emissions. One of the first steps we can do is develop policy. How are we going to measure it? Through metric is miles traveled, and the target date is a percentage of reduction based against your baseline from 2025. That baseline year we talked about earlier is probably the year where you have most complete and recent data. So this can also be compared against a baseline by using the metric that would measure each action. I highly recommend working with your teams. It's no one's singular job to create a strategy around carbon reduction. It's really useful to understand what metrics will be viable for your team to measure and what metrics you already measure. When we work with organizations, we often do a lot of stakeholder engagement just to map that out in the first instance, because it needs to be something that can be monitored year on year. So you don't want to be changing your metric. You also don't want to be setting a target that's going to be too ambitious or not ambitious enough. So it's really important that those are agreed within a stakeholder setting and that they are also embedded in the teams in a way that they will be able to collate that information and keep monitoring it and feeding it back to a central source of data collection. Well-designed and effective mitigation interventions in our companies really do have to link back up to strategic drivers. And I think the SDGs are a great way to create a framework that you can drip down from and set your targets. So ensuring that you're also recognizing that there are social goals around fuel poverty, community cohesion, and public health that also come back up to that strategic level of the SDGs, the Sustainability Development Goals set out by the UN. So when we're talking about measuring reduction in carbon intense activities, we should also be considering how we can measure the co-benefits that are being realized through our communities, especially in housing where we have residents, but also clearly have a greater impact on the health and well-being and opportunities of the communities that our stock is located in. Just coming on to the last slides here. So principles for action planning. Every journey starts with measuring. We talked about this in a few slides above with the accounting. You want to begin by defining clear and specific goals. What do you actually want to achieve with your plan? Whether it's a personal project or a business initiative, you're always going to need to have that clarified. And that will also mean that when you're sharing your business case, you are able to point back to the fact that this is either embedded in data that you have specifically around the need to reduce your carbon, to improve your households, or it is linked to international standards on what needs to be achieved for decarbonising our sector. Break down the tasks is the second move here. You're going to divide your goal into smaller manageable tasks that makes the process less overwhelming and allows you to focus on one step at a time. For example, if your goal is to write a whole strategy on sustainability and how to decarbonise your housing stock, you're going to break it down into the smaller tasks of actually what do we need to understand about our baseline, who do we need to get involved in understanding that baseline, and what follow-up actions do we need for monitoring that baseline. Also need to be assigning responsibilities. Like I said, this is a stakeholder activity whenever you're working towards a decarbonisation or retrofit strategy. So you want to determine who will be responsible for each task. And whether you're working individually or part of a team, you'll still need to define the roles and responsibilities between those who you're going to be sourcing information from. Setting a realistic deadline is going to be key. I know that might sound a bit patronizing here, but it really is something that I feel we all get the motivation to write a decarbonisation strategy or retrofit strategy and think that we need it in 2 months' time because a certain board or committee is going to be sitting then and you'd like to submit it for that. But never underestimate the amount of time it takes to collect data, especially around decarbonisation projects. It's going to be really key to understand, is there a deliverable you can get in time for that main board event that will give them enough information, but will also allow you to continue to progress over the next few months to understand, to develop your plan, because that plan will be in place for perhaps 5-10 years to get you towards your decarbonisation journey. You also want to be thinking already ahead at that, monitoring the progress. With any plan in place, you're going to need to establish processes and procedures that will allow you to regularly review your process and also check that you can adapt it to be flexible with any changing policy that emerges, such as new regulations to replace boilers, for example, in your housing stock, or also to take advantage of any funding that emerges. It's also important to celebrate your achievements, and that's a step we've missed off here. You want to be able, during that journey of starting to measure, that when you are doing those check-in points to assess your progress against your targets, that you're celebrating those small victories of reduced impact with your teams and also externally. We see a lot of this on LinkedIn now, especially from housing associations who are reporting against the social housing, the sustainability reporting standard for social housing, which is a standard for reporting environmental, social and governance goals to their investors so that they have a better idea of how they are publicly showing themselves to be moving towards a more sustainable way of running their sector and their services. The principles of action planning, I think it's really important to get that first step right, which is why I spent more time on it. After that, you're looking at setting targets, and we often talk about SMART targets: specific, measurable, achievable, realistic and time-bound. But the setting of the targets can't be underestimated. I would highly recommend looking at the local goals you have for decarbonising as well as national standards, but internally understanding what your big hitters are and seeing if you realistically will be able to access funds that will allow you to make the significant change that you need to decarbonise that activity. I gave an example earlier, which is around your communal heat networks, perhaps, if you have those operating. If they're on gas, do you have substantial, significant fans to enable you and the time to upgrade those systems to low carbon energy solutions instead? So setting targets all sounds great, but it does need some critical reflection on what you can actually achieve in the time and with the money. I'll leave some summary of resources towards the end of this report, because I think it's really good to be able to check in and check the facts yourself so you feel confident explaining them back to anyone. We are currently asking for anyone who's attended as well to, if you are considering doing a retrofit project, please complete a self-assessment form if you haven't already. This is a mandatory first step to receive direct RISE support from ourselves. And through that, we can offer you support in project identification for a retrofit, improving your data and identifying areas that might be great for retrofit because it's a hot spot of concentration of potential projects there. We also give advice on resident engagement plans, procurement, delivery plans, and generally the whole spectrum of retrofit. We're happy to give a diagnostic call after submitting a self-assessment. That diagnostic call allows us to baseline where you're at in terms of your readiness to deliver retrofit. I'm sure many of you are already on it and have submitted a self-assessment or feeling very mature. But because it's a free service, I really recommend just checking in with us again. It's a good free consultancy ear. It's a second opinion, and you come talk to us about your ambitions and we can address what the gap is, be that funding, skills, or just time, and work with you to better improve your retrofit plans.